Mr. Secretary, I watched President Bush deliver a moving speech at the United Nations in September 2003, in which he mentioned the crisis of the sex trade. The president called for the punishment of those involved in this horrible business. But at the very moment of that speech, DynCorp was exposed for having been involved in the buying and selling of young women and children.
DynCorp and Fluor have won 5-year contracts to support the U.S. troop buildup in Afghanistan. They beat out the current contractor, KBR. Now, the contracts would be worth as much as $7.5 billion for each company.
In 1989, I joined the Lincoln, Nebraska Police Force and graduated from the Nebraska Law Enforcement Academy. During my 10 years as a police investigator, I specialized in child sex crimes and domestic violence. I was no stranger to evildoers and violence being perpetrated against women and children. In 1999, I would be heading off to Bosnia as an international police force task member. I certainly never expected to be terminated less than 2 years later and find myself in a foreign country fighting to save my reputation as a police officer and defend my integrity and honesty against a multi-billion-dollar United States private government contractor. Since that time, I've been standing in front of audiences around the globe describing my experiences within the United Nations mission. The film and the book have allowed me to share my findings and the stories of the victims in an effort to educate the naive and expose the injustices perpetuated both abroad and here in the United States, where injustices can only be described as a disease. This disease continues today and is destroying the very framework that was created to set the example of international law and justice. During my years as a UN human rights investigator, I observed many diverse and inexcusable acts. These acts included sexual harassment of female employees within the walls of the UN, government contractors and international aid workers who were becoming end users of pornography, strip clubs, and the facilitation of prostitution. I interviewed international police officers and international aid workers who admittedly purchased foreign women to keep at home as their girlfriends. I became aware of rape tapes being distributed by the Department of Defense contractors on military bases. I worked with Bosnian law enforcement officers who put their lives and jobs on the line when they reported cases of military and UN officials participating in the transport of young girls across international borders. I witnessed the inaction and dismissive behavior of UN officials on reports of sexual violence and sexual misconduct alleged against UN peacekeepers. I witnessed and experienced and lived the retaliation against those officials who tried to investigate and report. I listened to derogatory comments directed at the innocent who were referred to as whores of war and just prostitutes. Then I documented my findings in an email to mission officials in an attempt to educate and raise the awareness of the issue internally. I was immediately accused of being burned out, demoted, and then terminated a few months later as a final act of the United Nations and private contractor retaliation against me. A further attempt to discredit me as a police officer and honest person was brought forward when the government contractor alleged that I had falsified my timesheets. I took my employer DynCorp to task in a British employment tribunal and won my case in a unanimous decision. My level of trust, honestly, with regard to the UN peacekeeping missions is limited. I believe that the general staff and staff members of the United Nations here in New York and the United Nations all over are very good people, and they're doing very hard work and have a very good heart and mean well. I think that the management within the United Nations from the highest levels has needed to be completely overhauled for decades. I think that there are continual cover-ups that take place with regard to many issues in mission areas. And for me, that is a complete slap in the face of what the United Nations is supposed to be all about. This should be about transparency and accountability and holding those individuals accountable for their wrongdoings. And I don't see that happening within the United Nations. I see individuals, just like with the private corporations, transferring those individuals around from mission to mission, just like what happened with Jacques-Paul Klein. Another interesting point that I'd like to bring up that Tanya may or may not know is Jacques-Paul Klein, although he may have been kicked out of the United Nations, is still making a great living traveling the world, doing teaching and all kinds of events at prestigious universities around the world. I think he was at Princeton for some time. This summer he came to the Netherlands in The Hague and did this wonderful, some sort of university credit program. And, it's incidents like that that really bother me. The credibility of the UN, I think they have a chance. I think they have a chance at coming back. I'm proud that tomorrow I'll be at the United Nations tomorrow. I was invited to go there and do a book signing. I have no fear of the United Nations. I have no fear of speaking my mind within the walls of the United Nations. But I do still have a fear of people working for the United Nations who want to do the same thing.
In 2010, the United Nations held a special screening of a feature film. The Whistleblower is based on events in the life of a woman who risked her life to expose the truth.
I have never considered myself a whistleblower, and even when I did report what was going on through numerous channels, I really felt that was just my job.
In 1999, 4 years after the end of the war in Bosnia, Catherine Bolkovac arrived at a United Nations building in Sarajevo as a newly hired member of the International Police Task Force. Bolkovac had spent 10 years as a cop in Lincoln, Nebraska. But now she was working for DynCorp, a private military contractor funded by the U.S. government.
We were working with 40 to 50 other nations worldwide, some who had very little training in the type of police work that we did in the United States. There was no accountability to anyone, really, other than this government contractor that we were working for. So it was very easy, I think, for people to just disregard any of their maybe morals or convictions or lifestyles that they had in the States and kind of go native, as they called it. And going native was something that a lot of men did there. One day, the local police department there, the Bosnian police, brought me a young girl who they had found dumped on the side of the road to my office, and I began an interview process with her.
The victim spoke no English, but kept repeating the word Florida. Bolkovac knew about the Florida Bar, a dive frequented by UN personnel. The film shows what happened next.
We started searching. I found under the bar an open metal container, like a box that closed that was open, and inside was U.S. dollars and a lot of passports, East European passports of young women, which were kept in that box.
And then, as she later wrote, I spotted a rickety set of stairs, which led to a wooden door. I did my best Magnum PI move and kicked it in. There on the other side, huddled 7 young women with terrified faces. Littered about were a few plastic grocery bags full of miniskirts and glittery tank tops. Their work clothes.
Where international money flows, so goes sex trafficking. Everyone knew what was going on. No one was willing to talk about it. No one was willing to actually stand up and say, hey, do you guys think this is kind of wrong? I was the first person to actually do that. This wasn't just the street cops and the corrupt few on the ground. This corruption flew all the way to the top of the United Nations and through our State Department and diplomats. So this was something that was going to actually hamper the good old boys club. And I think that probably for that reason alone, was the reason a lot more pressure was being put on me to stop these investigations.
She didn't stop. On October 9th, 2000, Bolkovac sent an email with the subject, "Do not read this if you have a weak stomach or guilty conscience."
If you think these girls are just prostitutes, you're mistaken. This is what prostitution is, and I gave them a definition. This is what human trafficking is. This is where these girls are coming from. This is how old they are. So, use your heads, guys. I sent that off to about 50 people. From the heads of to the UN mission, to DynCorp managers, to my fellow colleagues, to human resources, to whoever I could think of that might make a difference, and felt relief. I had had threats made toward me on a daily basis as a police officer. I mean, that's something you just get used to. It was very unsettling to be in Bosnia, to not have my gun at my side, to not have people I could trust, to have to be really thinking about who I could trust. And when those people who I thought I did trust were warning me that, things were being talked about, a lot of gossip in the UN headquarters, a lot of DynCorp employees were plotting behind my back. So those were some pretty unsettling moments for me.
Bolkovac was reassigned to a desk job to get her out of the way. But instead, it gave her access to files she could use to prove her case. Soon after, DynCorp fired her for supposedly falsifying timesheets. She gathered up her evidence and escaped by car from Bosnia into Holland.
When I left the country with the files is the first time I actually broke down and cried. I was pretty rattled, but for the most part, I was able to maintain my composure and gather enough evidence and basically get the hell out of the country.
Bolkovac sued DynCorp in England over her dismissal. The court found that her investigative work was the real reason she was fired. But that was as far as the system would allow her to go. She settled out of court, wrote a book, and traveled the world telling her story. When the movie starring Rachel Weisz screened at the UN, people were appalled.
corruption within the United Nations, corruption in private contracting, what we're really doing in this world with all these peace-building missions, human trafficking, gender issues, women's issues. But, bottom line, here we are 10, 15 years later, no real changes have been made at the United Nations.
Now a grandmother of 6, Catherine Bolkovac has been blackballed from international peacekeeping, the work she loves best. Yet she has no regrets.
Don't be afraid to change the world. Don't be afraid to speak out. And, but if you do, just be forewarned. You need to realize this is not an easy road ahead of you. And if you're not prepared for that, you're going to have a really hard time.
Joined here by one of my favorite people in the world, Kiki Palmer and the brilliant Sergio Hudson.
Hello. I assume that Sergio Hudson designed this incredible
Yes.
ensemble we have tonight.
Oh
Tell
my
me a
God,
little
can
bit
we
about
see
it.
the train?
Oh my gosh. Well, this is a gorgeous dress. He can explain as well, but obviously, you want to go and do your thing? I'm just going to explain it for you.
Okay, well, when I saw Kiki, I saw, Hollywood royalty, black Hollywood royalty. So I immediately thought about Josephine Baker in her heyday. And this was around the same time of like late 50s, early 60s when Carl was at Pet 2. So I wanted to give like a nod to that era with this.